I had exactly 15 steps before the vintage Dom Perignon hit the crystal flutes and the sniper's bullet hit his heart. My hand didn't shake as I folded the receipt, it wouldn't dare. In this industry, hesitation is just another word for liquidation. The paper felt heavy, not because of the card stock, but because of the 7 words I'd scrawled on the back. Around me, the vault operated with the cold precision of a Swiss bank. There was no boisterous laughter here, only the hushed, terrifying hum of old money. The clink of silver against bone china sounded like coins dropping into a terrifyingly deep well. Outside, the New York skyline was a chaotic grid of red and green tickers, but in here, the air was still. Stagnant. The kind of silence that comes right before a market crash. I approached table 1, fully aware I was walking a tightrope between a tip and a funeral. Choi Song-kwon sat with his back to the panoramic window, the city lights framing him like a jagged halo. He didn't look like a thug, he looked like a blue-chip stock that was too volatile to touch. Sharp features, tattoos peeking out from the collar of a bespoke suit that cost more than my tuition, and eyes that were completely unreadable. Beside him, Min Soo-kyung leaned in, resting a manicured hand on his forearm. Her diamonds caught the low light, scattering fractured spectrums across the linen. To the untrained eye, she looked like a woman securing her future marriage. She wasn't. 10 minutes ago, I realized she was actually securing his assets for a rival conglomerate. I had been pouring the sparkling water, blending into the background the way only a black waitress in a high-end establishment can, invisible, unnoticed, a piece of the furniture. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a whispered conversation in a wine cellar, it was quieter than that. Soo-kyung had adjusted her napkin, 3 taps with her index finger. A gesture that didn't match the etiquette of the room. I followed her gaze to the window reflection behind Choi. A glint of metal. A suppressor. She hadn't adjusted her napkin. She had signaled the sell order on Choi's life. The vault wasn't listed on Google Maps. You didn't make a reservation here, you inherited one. Deep beneath the bedrock of Manhattan, the walls were lined with repurposed safety deposit boxes from the 1920s, now holding rare vintages instead of gold bars. The air always smelled of truffle oil and old money, a scent I'd learned to despise and study in equal measure. I adjusted the cuffs of my uniform, smoothing away wrinkles that didn't exist. To the titans of industry dining here, I was a ghost. A pair of hands pouring water, a shadow clearing plates. They spoke freely in front of me, discussing mergers and illicit shorts, assuming I didn't understand the language of leverage. They were wrong. I wasn't just working for tuition, I was auditing a masterclass in corruption. Tonight, Table 1 was the only ticker that mattered. Choi Song-kwon had been staring at the same spot on the wall for 20 minutes. He possessed a terrifying kind of stillness, the apathy of a man who could crash a currency with a phone call and then go back to eating his risotto. He didn't touch his wine. He didn't touch his phone. He just sat there, radiating a controlled, predatory boredom that made the busboys tremble when they walked past. His companion, however, was leaking data like a breached server. Min Soo-kyung was undeniably beautiful, draped in silk that probably cost more than my father's life insurance payout. But beauty doesn't cover up volatility. While Song-kwon looked like a statue, Soo-kyung was vibrating. Her eyes darted to the service entrance, then to the window, then back to her wrist. She checked her diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe 3 times in 4 minutes. It wasn't the impatient check of a woman bored with her date. It was the precise, synchronized check of someone running a countdown. I watched her from the wait station, analyzing the discrepancy. A woman about to marry a billionaire doesn't look at the time, she looks at the ring. She looks at the man. Soo-kyung looked at everything except him. I picked up the water pitcher, stepping out of the shadows. As I moved toward them, I saw her hand tremble, just a fraction, as she reached for her clutch. It was a micro-tremor, a glitch in the perfect facade. In the market, we call that a leading indicator. Something was about to break. And judging by the cold indifference in Songkwan's eyes, he had no idea the crash was coming for him. I stepped in to refill the sparkling water, my movements practiced and unobtrusive. The crystal pitcher was heavy in my hand, sweating with condensation that mirrored the chill running down my spine. As the water cascaded into Songkwan's glass, creating a vortex of bubbles, my gaze drifted past his shoulder to the floor-to-ceiling window behind him. At night, the glass turned into a dark mirror, reflecting the opulent dining room against the backdrop of the city's void. That's when I saw the anomaly. It wasn't a trick of the light or a smudge on the pane. High above, on the rooftop of the building across the street, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. A glint of metal flared briefly, not the frantic strobe of a camera flash, but the dull, matte-absorbed ion of a sniper's scope. Then, a cylindrical silhouette extended over the ledge. A silencer. My breath hitched, trapped in my throat like a swallowed coin. The pieces of the night snapped together with the violence of a margin call. The 3 taps on the table. The glances at the watch. Min Soo-kyung wasn't nervous about a proposal, she was impatient for the kill. She had positioned him perfectly, back to the glass, framing him like a corporate portrait waiting to be slashed. I looked down at Songkwan. He was swirling his wine, completely unaware that his stock had just hit 0. Panic flared, hot and bright, urging me to drop the pitcher and run. To dive under a table. To be anywhere but in the blast radius of a high-value assassination. But panic is for amateurs. In finance, you don't run from volatility, you hedge against it. If I did nothing, the glass would shatter in seconds. Songkwan would die. The police would lock down the building. I'd be interviewed, my background checked, my anonymity stripped away. I would become a witness to a mob hit, a loose end for the people Soo-kyung worked for. If I saved him, the risk was infinite, but so was the potential return. I finished the pour without spilling a drop, though the sound of the water rushing into the glass roared in my ears like a tsunami. I stepped back, retreating into the shadows of the service station. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the room. I reached into my apron, my fingers brushing against the cold plastic of a cheap ballpoint pen and the rough texture of the bill pad. I tore off a blank receipt. It felt flimsy, insignificant against the weight of a human life. I didn't look up. I didn't check to see if Soo-kyung was watching. I pressed the pen to the paper, the ink flowing dark and permanent. I wrote fast, my handwriting sharp and urgent, stripping the message down to the only data points that mattered. Do not drink. Reflection in window. Target. I capped the pen. The die was cast. I had just inserted myself into a transaction that was way above my pay grade. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our little dark romance family stretch across cities, countries, and time zones. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you leave here helps us keep unraveling these dangerous love stories and high-stakes betrayals together. So find your quiet place, dim the lights, and get ready. Let's begin. The walk back to table 1 felt less like waitressing and more like walking the plank. 15 steps. That was the distance between anonymity and becoming a complicit variable in a gangland execution. I carried a silver tray with a single, pristine coaster on it, a prop for the sleight of hand I was about to perform. Soo-kyung was busy typing a text on her phone, the screen angled away, shielding her treason. Perfect. The window of opportunity was a sliver, narrow as a high-frequency trading gap. I reached the table. Pardon the intrusion, I murmured, my voice steady, stripped of any tremor that could tip off the algorithms of social etiquette. I reached for Songkwan's whiskey glass, the Glenfiddich 30 he hadn't touched. I lifted it just an inch, pretending to wipe condensation that wasn't there. With my other hand, I slid the fresh coaster down, the folded receipt tucked flush against its underside. It was a seamless transaction. To the room, it was 5-star service. To him, it was a lifeline. I set the heavy crystal tumbler back down with a soft clink. My thumb pressed against the rim for a fraction of a second too long, a deliberate breach of protocol designed to pull his focus. It worked. Songkwan's gaze snapped from the void of the room to my hand, and then down to the jagged white corner of paper protruding from beneath the heavy glass. He didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. The vein in his neck didn't even jump. He simply froze, his predatory boredom instantly replaced by a sharp, terrifying focus. He slid the glass a millimeter to the right, revealing the scrawl. Do not drink. Reflection in window. Target. I watched his eyes track the words. It took him less than a second to process the data, analyzing the threat with the speed of a quantum computer. He didn't look at the window. He didn't look at his fiancée, who was now smiling at her phone like a cat that had just swallowed the canary. Instead, slowly, deliberately, he looked up at me. For the first time all night, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't furniture. His eyes were dark voids, stripping me bare, assessing my value, my motive, my threat level. It was the look of a CEO reading a hostile tender offer. There was no gratitude there yet, only cold, brutal calculation. He tapped his index finger once on the table. Acknowledged. Then, the corner of his mouth quirked up, not in a smile, but in a lethal grimace. He had the inside information. The market had just shifted in his favor, and he was ready to liquidate the competition. Stay close, he murmured, his voice a low rumble that didn't travel past our intimate sphere. My stomach dropped. I hadn't just warned him. I'd been hired. The silence in the vault shattered, not with a scream, but with the screech of heavy oak against marble. Songkwan didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for clarification. He treated my intel with the immediate execution of a stop-loss order. One moment, he was a statue of boredom, the next, he was a blur of kinetic violence. He kicked the heavy table upward, the legs leaving the floor as he upended the entire spread, crystal, china, the untouched Glenfiddich, into a chaotic barricade. Crack. The sound wasn't loud, the glass behind him didn't shatter, it just spiderwebbed with a sickening hiss. The bullet meant for his heart embedded itself in the underside of the mahogany table just as it crashed onto its side. Get down, he roared, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the dining room. I dropped to the floor, covering my head as the room exploded into panic. Screams erupted from the other tables. The wealthy patrons, usually so composed, scrambled like rats on a sinking ship. Sukyung sat frozen for a fraction of a second, her perfect mask slipping. She looked at the overturned table, then at the spiderwebbed window, and finally at Songkwan, who was now crouching behind the makeshift shield, a gun appearing in his hand as if he'd pulled it from the air. The look on her face wasn't fear. It was the fury of a broker whose insider trade had just been flagged by the SEC. Her eyes locked onto mine, the invisible waitress huddled near the service station. She knew. Plan B, she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly, stripping away the elegance of the doting fiancé. Execute. Now. She wasn't pretending anymore. She reached into her clutch, not for a phone this time, but for something metallic. 3 men at the bar stood up in unison. The businessmen near the kitchen reached into their jackets. The hostile takeover wasn't just a sniper, it was a liquidation sale, and everything must go. Songkwan fired first. 2 shots, deafening in the enclosed space. The vase on the hostess stand exploded. He wasn't shooting to kill yet, he was creating a diversion. He grabbed my wrist, his grip like a steel cuff. You wanted to be involved, he snarled, pulling me toward the kitchen doors as bullets began to chew up the upholstery around us. Then move. The double doors swung shut behind us, muting the gunfire into dull, rhythmic thuds. The kitchen of the vault was a stainless steel labyrinth, a stark contrast to the velvet silence of the dining room. Here, it was all heat, steam, and the chaotic shouting of chefs who hadn't yet realized their menu now included a shootout. Songkwan didn't slow down. He navigated the prep stations with the efficiency of a shark moving through a reef, knocking aside a tray of unfinished amuse-bouches. He held my wrist in a vice grip, dragging me past the bewildered line cooks. I stumbled, my heels sliding on the greasy tile, but I didn't fight him. In a hostile takeover, you don't argue with the person pulling you out of the burning building. Back exit, he barked, not looking at me. Where? Blocked, I gasped, my mind racing through the floor plan I'd memorized not for safety, but for efficiency during the dinner rush. Delivery trucks are parked at the South Dock until 10 p.m. It's a bottleneck. We'll be trapped. Songkwan stopped, pivoting so sharply my shoulder wrenched. He pinned me against a stack of industrial flour sacks, his gun raised, checking the sight line behind us. For a second, I thought he was going to leave me there, cut his losses and dump the liability. He looked down at me, his chest heaving, searching my face for the hysteria that should have been there. He expected tears. He expected a civilian paralyzed by the sudden introduction of ballistics into her evening shift. What he found was a risk assessment. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't crying. My eyes were darting from the service elevator to the trash compactor chute, calculating the probability of interception. I didn't scream, I said, my voice sounding strange and detached in my own ears. Screaming wastes oxygen. We need the north disposal corridor. It exits into the alley behind the stock exchange building. No cameras. No trucks. Something flickered in Songkwan's eyes. Surprise? Respect? Or maybe just the realization that the asset he dragged out of the fire had a higher ROI than he anticipated. Lead, he commanded, releasing my wrist and shoving me forward. I hiked up my skirt and ran. I didn't think about the gunman breaching the kitchen doors behind us. I didn't think about the sniper. I thought about the logistics of escape, treating the maze of the kitchen like a complex derivative equation that needed to be solved. We burst through the heavy steel door of the north corridor, the winter air hitting us like a physical blow. The alley was dark, narrow, and silent. Car, Songkwan said, pointing to a black sedan idling 3 car lengths away. Get in. I'm just the waitress, I breathed, the adrenaline finally starting to shake my hands. Not anymore, he said, opening the rear door and shoving me inside. Now, you're the only one who saw the reflection. The safe house was a penthouse in Tribeca that felt less like a home and more like a server room with a view. The windows were reinforced polycarbonate, the walls lined with monitors displaying live feeds of the city, and the air hummed with the quiet, expensive sound of high-end filtration. Songkwan didn't offer me a drink. He paced the length of the slate-gray floor, shedding his ruined jacket. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, radioactive suspicion. He stopped abruptly, turning to face me. Who are you? He demanded. A waitress doesn't spot a silencer reflection in a darkened window. A waitress doesn't calculate exit vectors. I'm an economics grad student, I said, leaning against a marble island to stop my legs from shaking. I wait tables to pay for the degree that tells me how men like you run the world. He scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound. And you saved me out of the goodness of your heart? I saved you because the math didn't add up. I pulled my phone from my apron pocket. The screen was cracked from the escape, but the display was still functional. I tapped open my brokerage app, which I used to trade my meager tips, and turned the screen toward him. Look at the volume on your company's stock, I said. K-Corp Logistics. He frowned, stepping closer. What about it? At 7:45 p.m., 15 minutes before your reservation, there was a massive spike in put options. Someone bet millions that your stock would tank by morning. That's not normal volatility, Mr. Choi. That's insider trading. I swiped to the next chart. Then look at the counterparty. These orders were routed through shell companies linked to Ravencroft Holdings. Songkwan went still. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ravencroft, he whispered. That's Sookyung's family trust. She wasn't checking her watch to time the sniper, I said, the realization settling over me like a heavy blanket. She was checking the market close in Asia. She needed you dead after the markets opened in Tokyo but before New York could react. She wasn't just killing you. She was shorting your life. He stared at the cracked screen, his expression shifting. The betrayal wasn't the heat of a lover's quarrel, it was the cold calculation of a balance sheet. He hadn't just been targeted for a hit, he was the primary asset in a hostile takeover. She's not a fiancé, he murmured, the realization hardening his features into stone. She's a corporate raider. He looked up at me, and the gun in his hand finally lowered to his side. She tried to crash my stock, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. So we're going to bankrupt her instead. We need to die, Songkwan said, staring at the monitors where K-Corp's ticker was already trembling. Not literally. Digitally. He pulled his phone out, removed the SIM card, and snapped it in half. It was a terrifying command, go dark. Silence, in the age of information, was an admission of guilt, or in this case, death. By not issuing a statement, by not proving proof of life, we were effectively confirming the rumors already swirling on Twitter, shootout at the vault. K-Corp's CEO missing, presumed dead. For the next 24 hours, the penthouse became a pressurized capsule. We sat on the floor, surrounded by the glow of 50-inch screens, watching the financial slaughter. It started at the opening bell in London. K-Corp's stock didn't just dip, it plummeted. The algorithms picked up the confirmed death rumors and executed mass sell-offs. The graph on the main screen looked like a cliff face, a jagged red line diving toward zero. You're losing billions, I whispered, clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee I'd found in the kitchenette. My stomach churned watching the wealth evaporate. It felt wrong, like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Paper losses, Songkwan corrected, though his jaw was set tight enough to crack a tooth. He sat with his back against the sofa, one leg drawn up, watching his empire burn with a masochistic focus. Let them think the king is dead. Let them get greedy. Ravencroft is buying, I pointed out, tapping the glass of my tablet. They're scooping up shares at fire sale prices. They're over-leveraging to acquire a controlling interest before the market realizes the company is still viable. Exactly, he said, turning his head to look at me. In the blue light of the monitors, the sharp angles of his face softened slightly. We were isolated from the world, two ghosts haunting a digital graveyard. The distance between us, billionaire and waitress, had evaporated in the heat of the crisis. We were just two analysts now, watching a trap snap shut. He passed me a bottle of water, his fingers brushing mine. The contact lingered, electric and heavy. Most people would have run, he said quietly. Or sold the story to TMZ. You're sitting here watching a stock chart. I told you, I said, meeting his gaze. I like to see how the math works out. You're not just watching the math, Nyara. You're orchestrating it. He shifted closer, the smell of expensive cologne and gun oil filling the space between us. For a moment, the plummeting stock didn't matter. The assassins didn't matter. There was only the quiet, terrifying intimacy of mutual destruction. We were burning it all down together, and I realized with a start that I trusted him more in this silence than I had ever trusted anyone in the noise of the real world. Wait for it to bottom out, he murmured, his eyes holding mine. Then we make them pay for every cent. $17.40, I announced, my voice cutting through the hum of the servers. That's the floor. Ravencroft has deployed their entire liquidity reserve to short you into oblivion. They're fully leveraged, betting everything that K-Corp goes to zero. Songkwan stood behind my chair, his hands resting on the backrest, enclosing me in his space. They think I'm a corpse, he murmured. They think there's no one left to defend the wall. Then let's remind them who owns the castle. My fingers hovered over the terminal. I wasn't just a waitress anymore, I was the executioner. We had routed Songkwan's offshore reserves, billions in capital hidden in the Caymans and Singapore, through a web of anonymous shell accounts. To the market, this wouldn't look like a CEO saving his company. It would look like a sudden, violent surge of institutional confidence. Ready? I asked, looking up at him. Burn them, he whispered. I hit execute. It wasn't a trickle, it was a tsunami. We unleashed $3 billion of buying power in a nanosecond. On the main screen, the jagged red line that had been nosediving all day hit an invisible concrete floor and bounced. Hard. The ticker flashed. The price jumped from $17.40 to $22 in a single tick. Then $28. Then $35. Here comes the squeeze, I said, a dark thrill curling in my stomach. Ravencroft was short. They had borrowed shares to sell them, promising to return them later. But to return them, they had to buy them back. As the price rocketed upward, their debt ballooned. They were trapped in a burning room with no exit. The graph turned vertical. A massive green candle shot up the screen like a skyscraper. Look at the volume, Songkwan said, leaning closer, his breath hot against my ear. They're panic buying. They're trying to cover their shorts, but every share they buy just drives the price higher. It was a feedback loop of destruction. The more Ravencroft tried to escape, the more they bled. We weren't just taking their money, we were taking their future. Their leverage evaporated. Their margin calls would be ringing off the hook in sleek offices all over Manhattan. Sookyung wasn't celebrating a takeover anymore. Somewhere in the city, she was watching her net worth disintegrate in real time, staring at a screen that was screaming a single, undeniable truth: he's alive. She's bankrupt, I whispered, watching the stock price cross its original high. By the time the market closes, she won't have enough capital to buy a cab ride out of the city. Songkwan's hand moved from the chair to my shoulder, a heavy, grounding weight. You didn't just save my life, Nyara, he said, his voice rough with triumph. You just bought me an empire. The champagne in the Ravencroft boardroom was vintage, but the celebration was premature. Min Sookyung stood at the head of the table, flanked by the nervous board members she had bullied into submission. She raised her glass, the bubbles rising like the ego that was about to kill her. To the acquisition, she beamed. The doors didn't bang open. There was no dramatic SWAT team entrance. Instead, the electronic locks on the boardroom doors simply clicked disengaged. Songkwan walked in first. He moved with the quiet lethality of a predator entering a pen of livestock. He wasn't wearing a wire, he was wearing a smirk. I followed a step behind him. I hadn't just changed my clothes, I'd changed my skin. The invisible waitress was gone. In her place was the woman who had just orchestrated the most violent short squeeze in market history. Sookyung dropped her glass. It shattered, spraying Krug in shards across the polished mahogany. You're dead. The reports confirmed. The market is full of speculation, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. I didn't hold a gun. I held a tablet. I slid it down the long table. It spun perfectly, stopping right in front of her. What is this? She whispered, staring at the screen. A margin call, I answered. Your shell companies were leveraged 50-1. When K-Corp stock tripled an hour ago, your lenders triggered an automatic liquidation. You didn't just lose the hostile takeover, Sookyung. You lost Ravencroft. You lost your personal trust. You lost the pension funds of the cartel backers who financed your little coup. Her face turned the color of ash. The backers. Songkwan finally spoke. He stopped beside her chair, leaning down to whisper in her ear, intimate and terrifying. I didn't call the police, Suk-young. That would be too kind. I called them. He gestured to the floor-to-ceiling window looking down at the street. Your investors are waiting in the lobby, Songkwan said softly. They are very disappointed with their returns. I told security to send you down. Suk-young looked at the door, then at the window, realizing there was no escape. The police would have been a mercy. The men waiting downstairs dealt in blood, not subpoenas. Minjun, please, she begged, reaching for his sleeve. He brushed her hand off like it was dust. You're trespassing on K-Corp property. Get out. She didn't scream as she left. She walked out like a ghost, trembling, knowing she was walking toward her own execution. When the door clicked shut, the silence in the room was heavy, charged with the kind of adrenaline that comes after a kill. The remaining board members scrambled out the side exit, terrified to make eye contact. We were alone. Songkwan turned to me. The adrenaline was still humming in the air between us, a live wire. He looked at the shattered glass, then at me. There was no hesitation in his eyes anymore. No wall between the billionaire and the help. He walked over to the head of the table, the seat Suk-young had vacated, and spun the leather chair around. He didn't sit in it. He looked at me. It's empty, he said. I walked toward him, the sound of my heels echoing on the marble. I stopped inches from him. I could smell the gunpowder he hadn't fully washed off and the sharp scent of victory. I'm not a waitress anymore, I whispered. No, he agreed, his hand coming up to cup my jaw, his thumb tracing my bottom lip. You're the one holding the leash. He kissed me then, not gentle, not romantic, but desperate and claiming. It tasted like violence and billions of dollars. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with a promise that terrified and thrilled me. Welcome to the board, Nyara.